I think we can start now. Welcome to the fourth session of CDR Stage Towards COP31. I am Pınar Öncel. I am co-hosting today with my dear colleague Göker Avcı. Well, let's wait a little bit more, like a minute or two, for everyone to join before we officially begin. We are recording this session and we will be uploading the webinar recording to our YouTube channel CDR Türkiye and share it with everyone who registered. Today, we will focus on one of the most important questions for the future of CDR, carbon dioxide removal. What kind of policy environment is needed to scale CDR with integrity? So, as CDR becomes increasingly relevant to climate targets and carbon markets, policy will shape which approaches can scale, how removals are recognized, how quality is governed, and how investment can be mobilized. Well, there are some familiar faces joining us. It's great to see friends and people who already joined the previous CDR stage sessions. And some newcomers as well. So welcome all. So far, we have explored the role of CDR in net zero, the evolution of CDR credits and financing, and the position of CDR within the COP31 agenda. Like we started in April, and today we take the next step and focus on the policy frameworks that can turn ambition into credible implementation. So, Göker, over to you.
Thanks, Pınar, and hello everyone. I am Göker Avcı. Today's session is titled as Scaling Carbon Dioxide Removal Through Policy, Lessons for Türkiye and the Wider Region. Technology, finance, and corporate demand are all essential for the development of CDR, but they do not operate in isolation. Policy creates the direction, confidence, and long-term conditions that allow technologies, projects, and of course markets to grow. We already see different governments experimenting with national incentives, procurement programs, certification systems, carbon market integration, and through public financing. At the same time, international mechanisms such as Article 6, the Paris Agreement creating mechanism, CORSIA, and the EU carbon removals and carbon farming framework are beginning to influence how countries design their own approaches. And our focus is today is practical. What lessons can we draw from the policies already being tested? Which mechanisms are working? What risks should countries avoid? And how can Turkey and the wider region position themselves while the global CDR policy landscape is still taking shape? When we refer to the wider region, by the way, we mean the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Balkans, and Central Asia, particularly the Turkic states. These regions have significant potential across biomass, mineralization, geological storage, industrial integration, and many other CDR pathways. The question is how policy can help turn that potential into credible and financeable projects. Over to you, Pınar.
Okay, before we introduce our dear speakers, we would like to understand who is in the room and the perspectives represented here today. So, Göker, could you please activate the first poll while I am reading the questions? So please, everyone, could you please reply to the questions that we will share with you? So the first question is, which best describes your current level of involvement with CDR policy? Are you actively working on CDR policy or regulation? Are you following policy developments closely? Are you working in CDR, climate or carbon markets, but not directly on policy? Or are you just exploring the topic for the first time? So this is our first question. So please vote for your replies and we will share the results and we will have an understanding of the group today. And I can actually, I think, read the second question as well. Let me do that as well. Which policy area are you most interested in today? National CDR strategies and incentives, international standards and Article 6, ETS and carbon market integration, public finance and market creation, or policy opportunities for Turkey and the wider region. I wonder if everybody is able to vote. Let me see. I think Yeah, I think we can, like if everybody already submit, we can share the results. Gökhan, maybe.
Uh,
Akan Williams says in chat, I can't access the poll. Well, it's actually on the screen. It should be active on your screen, but I don't know what is the problem. Sometimes, I don't know. That we have been facing some problems through Teams. Sorry for that. But we see that 50% of the people are actively working on CDR, climate policy, or regulation. And some people are following policy developments closely. And we have some people who are exploring the topic for the first time or working in the climate, CDR or carbon markets, but not directly on policies. That's great.
so it looks like we have some CDR policy people here, which is great news for us. And of course, these poll results will help us understand where the strongest interest and knowledge gaps are today. And we will be shaping our future webinars through these answers. So, we are very pleased to welcome two speakers who bring complementary perspectives on CDR policy, finance, international frameworks, and implementation. Our first speaker is Inji Johnston, Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Net Zero Lab. Inji's work brings together climate law, international governance, carbon markets, and the policy frameworks shaping the development of carbon removal.
And we are also delighted to welcome Atilla Yücel, carbon dioxide removal financing lead at the Negative Emissions platform. Attila works at the intersection of CDR policy, market development, and finance, with a strong focus on conditions needed to scale high integrity removals. So thank you both, Attila and Inji, for joining us today. Before we begin the main discussion, we would love for both of you to briefly introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your work, and if you would like, share a few opening thoughts on today's topic and why you believe policy has become such a critical part of scaling carbon dioxide removal. Attila, perhaps we can start with you and followed by Inji.
Can I hand over to Inji to start with the lady first? Is that all right with everyone? Inji, would you like to take over first?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Well, so first off, thank you for the invitation. It's a delight to be here and to see such energy emerging over such a critical topic. So, as was mentioned, my name is Inji Johnson. I'm based here in Munich at the Net Zero Lab, but formerly from Oxford. And so many of you may have heard of me in their other roles. So my work really spans international carbon markets, right from Article 6 to emissions trading schemes, the voluntary carbon market, and kind of everything in between. And a lot of the past work, including the Oxford offsetting principles, the roadmap for net zero aligned carbon market regulation, or the Oxford principles for responsible engagement with Article 6, all really try to attack this question of policy and policy certainty from a number of different dimensions. And so really looking forward to diving into some of that nitty-gritty today, and really do commend the organizers for organizing such a very topical theme for us to discuss today, because just to start us off with some thoughts, what's really interesting about CDR policy making and that is different from general climate policy is that actually, we know we need to continue to develop CDR towards net zero, but also beyond. And so actually it makes it quite a different beast to regulate in comparison to, say, emission reductions, but it also creates a lot more opportunity because we know we need it this century and in centuries to come. And so we'll just start off with that thought and pass it over to Attila. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone, merhabalar. So my name's Attila. I work with the Negative Emissions Platform, which is an industry association for permanent carbon dioxide removal. And what I do is I basically bring together around 60 companies and policymakers to work on strengthening the investment and financing funding conditions in order to get this sector up and running. So this sector that I work on is the one on permanent CDR, permanent carbon dioxide removal, and I get to do this from Brussels, which is the epicenter of EU climate policy making. Now, before I joined this sector, I was working as a consultant on green finance, and before that, I was working as a government advisor on sustainable economic development. And I see a colleague here online from GIZ. I used to be I'm a GIZ veteran, basically. And so because of that, I had the opportunity to work in depth in the region the Southwest Asia region, basically, including in Amman, Ramallah, Cairo, Baghdad, and I did spend some time also in Turkey. Now, I should clarify for our viewers, I do have a Turkish name, but I am a German national. And so I'm part of the diaspora. That means all of my information that I have on Turkey today is based on reliable secondary sources like Pilar and Göker. And I love that country. I studied partly there, but for today, I rely on you guys, and I'd like to invite those 50% who are working on CDR policy to join the conversation. Now, allow me to also just say a word on you asked Pilar about the role of policy and why it's so important. Yesterday, I wanted to meet with Pilar. She couldn't turn on her laptop because it was too hot in boardroom, basically. And so this is one indication. We've all been through heat waves. There's extreme risks, extreme weather-related risks. That are increasing in frequency and in terms of impact. And so what we really need to see is obviously deep emission cuts, but also carbon dioxide removal. And it is expected carbon removal will help stabilize global temperature rise, but also to bring temperatures back down. The problem, as Ingi rightly alluded to, is basically scaling this industry, right? From today to around 2 million tons of permanent CDR to gigatons by 2050. And that's not going to happen by itself, just because it's, in my opinion, a whole of economy waste management issue. No individual buyer is going to sustain this. And so it needs policy to plug that green premium gap, basically. Now, I will also just say a word on Turkey, where I placed Turkey on the map. In my view, Turkey holds a very special place, and we will be talking about Turkey today. Just let me say this. Turkey is an upper middle income economy by World Bank standard. It is an OECD member, and it is also a G20 member. It has, as a matter of fact, industrialized much later than most of European countries. And yet, when it comes to climate policy, it is almost as ambitious as the EU. It has a net zero target year for 2053. And so that puts it under pressure to decarbonize its industry while still being able to grow and prosper for benefit of its society, right? So that matters for Turkey, and that puts it at a very special place because it's sitting next to the biggest carbon market, which is Europe, on the one hand, and then countries on the other hand, which have a deep stake and deep expertise when it comes to the carbon management infrastructure. And so I believe it can geostrategically benefit from these opportunities, and we'll talk about these, but that's the lens that I will basically put on today.
Thank you both. And I think your opening remarks already show that CDR policy cannot be separated from current affairs or, of course, national circumstances. So let's begin with national policy approaches and the practical lessons emerging from countries that have already started building support for CDR. Countries and regions have introduced different combinations of public procurement, tax incentives, funding programs, and carbon market policies. Policy design may need to respond to very different economic, institutional, and development conditions. Which national examples stand out to you, and what can we learn from the way these policies have been designed and implemented? What lessons can we draw about designing CDR policies that reflect local priorities, capabilities, and development needs, rather than simply copying models from other countries? Maybe you can, Attila, you can go first, and Ingi, you can follow. Thank you.
Yeah, so that really gets into the nitty-gritty of CDR policymaking, which has, on the one hand, a lot to do with regulations, but on the other, as you say, Göker, with industrial policy instruments, tools that can really incentivize investments into this emerging and nascent space. I just want to firstly lay out a mental map for our audience, the viewers. And this is part of the toolkit that I authored at Negative Emissions Platform, and Pilar will share it after the call. So first of all, when you strip away all the jargon, basically every policy instrument is one of three things. It's one, either a foundation, which is a regulatory framework that enables the removals or the infrastructure, or second, it's a supply push carrot, which basically helps build capacity on the supply side, or it's a demand pull lever that creates a buyer and a price, which then helps to mature and basically mature the sector, but at its peak is a compliance market that requires polluters to pay for carbon dioxide removal. Now, having said that, different countries have taken on different approaches, and that's very important to bear in mind. So I'd like to stress that the choice of instruments that any country makes is, in my opinion, likely affected by its path dependency, by advocacy coalitions, and policy windows. Right now, we have an energy crisis again going on, so that puts countries and governments under strain, under constraint. But let me give you an example. The US, for example, has heavily lent on tax credits. It's famous and well-known Q45 tax credit, right? Because, in my opinion, it has no federal carbon market that it can build on. And so, in contrast, the EU can't work with tax credits. Its tax is a national state competency. And so instead, the EU, for example, works with common regulations and standards, and of course, with its EU ETS, its flagship carbon market. So again, the individual choice of instrument that any country and government will make is highly context specific. Another example is the UK. The UK is quite progressively relying on what we call contracts for differences, which basically is a price guarantee for these novel technologies. One reason why it is so confident about these instruments is because it has a lot of experience. It has used these contracts for difference in the past for wind offshore energy, for example. Having said that, I think there's one case which is, in my opinion, which stands out, and I may be biased here, but it's Germany. So if I were to suggest one country case for Turkey to study, it would be Germany. In my opinion, it's not because of the budget, of course, but it's because of the conditions, the starting conditions. Germany, like Turkey, has a deep industrial base, including steel, cement, chemicals, same in Turkey. It has a deep engineering and equipment manufacturing know-how and base, same in Turkey. And it has a firm or ambitious net zero commitment. And so what Germany did is actually quite valuable and interesting. So first of all, the government is funding research, just to plug the research, the foundational knowledge gaps, right? It has two very important projects, which you can look up online. One is called CDR Mare, the other is called CDR Terra. And so these projects look into the technologies, their potentials, trade-offs, co-benefits, risks, but also the public acceptance of them. Second, the government in Germany has also enacted a new enabling regulation or law, which basically allows to put CO2 underground or to build the transport infrastructure. And this is very important. It's the railway on which CDR will happen. And then thirdly, the government in Germany is working on a long-term negative emission strategy, something which is a low regret option for Turkey, for example, and very useful still. So in this long-term strategy, Germany, for example, is working on separate targets for permanent CDR all the way through 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045. And lastly, I'll just add this, Germany has also put in a new budget line. A budget line which allows the government to do two things, to subsidize the projects, but also to act as a buyer. And although the budget is a most critical and crucial challenge, I think Turkey can start with a very humble and small starting position when it comes to that. So I'll stop here. I'm sure Inji has more to add.
Inji, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, yeah, of course. And yeah, really grateful for that deep dive into providing some specifics. I think I'll zoom out a little bit more again to speak a bit more broadly about what we see on that policy landscape. As Attila mentioned, I think we see this really notable split between supply side policies as well as demand side policies. Also, we see a split between a regulation that recognizes the role of the government as the driving force behind deployment and indeed demand, and others that seek to integrate much more of that private sector demand, either directly through emissions trading schemes or other sort of taxes and things like that. So I think it is interesting to think about it on that spectrum, and just echo that there's really not a kind of one size fits all approach. And why that is because carbon dioxide removal is like any other resource. Every country around the world has certain comparative advantages and disadvantages, has certain needs in terms of that end goal of reaching net zero or neutralizing residual emissions, and also different deployment potentials. And this really matters when we start looking at the world of Article 6 and the potential to scale trading under it. But it's also really fundamental from designing the policy architectures that one might need in place. And to kind of put another framework around it, building off of this roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulation that we released last year, really there's also kind of three types of input sources to policies that we see. Of course, there's direct regulation. So when you're setting up an emissions trading scheme or other kind of regulatory bill that is directly addressing CDR. You also have enabling regulation. So what's been quite interesting, and given the diversity of CDR approaches, is there's some real stumbling blocks sometimes, perhaps in environmental protection legislation, in terms of water access and use, in terms of interactions with local biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of complex interactions between the specific deployment paths and the rest of the regulatory architecture, and these need to be explained and explored. Another good example is when you're especially getting into the more routes of commodification and trading and exchange, there can still be some really fundamental basics missing. For instance, the definition of a carbon credit and legal liabilities. And so really considering that enabling regulation is also a big part of that overall regulatory ecosystem. So those are two kind of within a jurisdiction, but then we also have and can't ignore the influence of certain standards and principles beyond that. For instance, as is emerging under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, but there's various others. And so it's really important to consider those types of principles and standards, because they can help offer sources of alignment, which can really then help in terms of interconnection between systems, driving that liquidity, driving that scale, and driving that market access. So that's a kind of bird's eye view. And I think it's really interesting that we do see that so far, much of the policy has focused on the supply side. And indeed, the IRA developments we saw in the US, that 45Q tax credit actually emerged way back in 2008. This was not necessarily a new piece of legislation. However, it was bolstered to get to that level in which it can have a significant difference at that $180 per ton of CO2. So sometimes the answers to developing the regulatory architecture already lie in our existing architectures and exploring how to use those in creative ways. Sometimes they require designing fresh regulation and unblocking the other types of issues that can present themselves in terms of that enabling regulation. So that is why I very much advocate for CDR policy to be integrated within that broader landscape, because that is really how you can set it up for success. Again, recognizing that this is not a short-term journey, it's a journey to net zero and beyond. And so would really encourage, and we will hopefully dive into some of those specific principles in that roadmap later in the session. But I'll leave it at that kind of high-level remarks about what good policy design for CDR looks like. Thank you.
Pınar, you're on mute.
Sorry for that. I didn't really remember I muted myself. Thank you so much, Inci and Attila. Like this is quite a complex situation as far as we can see. Both of you highlighted many aspects and different angles, and we can understand through your comments that how public policy can create early demand and investment confidence that an emerging sector needs. There's so much to be done through policy. And we can see obviously here that national policy does not develop in isolation. Like it depends on many things in within the borders and outside of the borders. So there are regional frameworks, international standards, and emerging market rules, and these are all increasingly influencing the choices the governments are making at home as well. So, Inci, could you walk us through the international policies a little bit more? Like, how should we understand the potential role of Article 6 Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, CORSIA, and that are shaping CDR? What could these mechanisms mean for demand? Like you already talked some about these, but like quality requirements or accounting or international cooperation. And my second question, for going a little bit deeper for Attila, is maybe you could talk about the current EU policy landscape, particularly the carbon removals and carbon farming legislation. How could the CRCF influence the recognition, certification, financing, and wider development of CDR projects within Europe? And also, it's not limited to Europe, as we all know, but there are many countries connected to the European market.
Absolutely, we can dive into this. So, what's really interesting, I mean, when we talk about something like the carbon market, I always explain it as there's three key buckets. So we have the voluntary carbon market. This was the earliest. It's where we've seen a lot of methodological innovation, obviously, where we see a lot of corporate demand, especially in this era of net zero. So that is one whole bucket. We then have the more regulatory kind of compliance markets. This is where these emission trading schemes have been established. Both of those tend to be jurisdictionally nested. So within a given jurisdiction, we can know what types of markets exist. What's really interesting about UNFCCC enabled markets, this being Article 6.2 and the PACM, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, as well as some of the ancillary ones, such as under CORSIA, these really offer the glue fundamentally between these different types of systems, between the voluntary and compliance. That is really where their power lies. And just to explain that pathway a little bit more. So, for instance, with Article 6.2, that is the framework that you generate internationally traded mitigation outcomes. So in essence, this is a really critical part of the CDR international exchange architecture, because this could be the key way that countries that do not have a lot of CDR capacity can ultimately reach that goal of net zero under the Paris Agreement. So without it, it's really difficult to claim that those investments have been made and that you've reached net zero in that regard. It also creates a huge export opportunity. So if you are a country, and there's several out there, that has actually already reached some form of net zero emissions, so where your emissions going out are balanced by removals coming in, if you can actually become a CDR exporter, that opens up a number of opportunities, not only to help service government demand under the Paris Agreement, but also corporate demand under CORSIA, for instance, for airlines, and potentially also for the international maritime sector under the IMO's net zero framework. So ultimately, through Article 6, you have a pipeline to not only address, government demand, but really private sector demand as well on a number of fronts. We're also seeing interest from and growing understanding about how the voluntary carbon market intersects with Article 6 and also compliance systems. And fundamentally, why it's so important to understand this, the role that Article 6 plays as this kind of glue between various forms of carbon markets is that, for instance, through the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, it's establishing standards. And through that, there's a real opportunity within domestic regulation to recognize that pathway and to ensure there's consistency in order to enable interoperability between these systems. They need to be able to talk to one another and communicate on the same level, but also achieve the same standards of environmental integrity, because this isn't our first experiment with international carbon markets nor international CDR markets. Even we had them in the Kyoto era. But to get it right under the Paris Agreement, we need to ensure common standards, and that can really help to unlock that future demand, as well as provide certainty on the part of project developers that the standard's known, the process of development is known, and ultimately there's confidence that there'll be this off-taker into the long term. So a long way of saying the international carbon market is really critical because it is one interoperable system. And so to effectively plug into that, you really do have to meet the common standard that it sets in order to be able to make it work for you and work for CDR. Thanks.
Pilar, you asked about the CRCF. So I'd like to invite everyone that we move from the global to now the European level. So the CRCF, I'll give you here the short summary, but for those of you who are interested, the best analysis that you can probably find is at Carbon Gap. So go ahead and look that up after the call. I'll give you the executive summary here. It's the CRCF, building on what Ingi just said, is the European quality standard in a nutshell. So it stands for Carbon Removal and Carbon Farming Regulation. It was established in 2024. And basically, it's a voluntary EU-wide standard that answers a deceptively hard question, which is what actually counts as a real credible carbon removal. It does cover the whole family of removals, I should say. So it has 3 pillars. One is the permanent CDRs, so permanent carbon removals in underground storage, for example. The second foundation is carbon farming, for example, in soils and peatlands. The third foundation or pillar is, I think, the carbon storage in products, long-lasting products, that is. The methodologies for each of these are being worked out. So this entire regulatory architecture is in development and in progression, but there are already individual methodologies. So pieces of regulation for example, direct air capture, bioenergy, and biochar. Now, what does it do? It regulates basically, in my words, for 4 things. And the EU calls it the quality. It's quality as the abbreviation. So basically, each ton of removed carbon must accurately be quantified and deliver a genuine benefit. Secondly, it must be additional, so beyond the business as usual, right? Thirdly, the storage must be long-lasting. And lastly, the monitoring and the reporting must cover the sustainability issues. So, for example, to avoid significant harm, do no significant harm. That's a DNSH principle, which means you can't use overly, disproportionately biomass, basically burning your forests, exaggerating, but you get the point. Now, from 2028, there will be an EU-wide registry. That's important. So that means that's the rails, basically, this EU-wide registry on which then the CRCF certified removals will be running. And so each claim can then be tracked and trusted and recorded. Now, why does this matter? Why does the CRCF matter? Because essentially, and Angie alluded to this, it's credibility that actually turns a removal into a tradable asset. Removals only trade if they're certified, if they're permanent, if they're verifiable. And that's basically the CRCF is basically the foundation in the EU. So you cannot procure a removal, for example, or subsidize one unless you really can define a credible basis for that. Now, for Turkey, let me come back to Turkey. What that basically means is quality standards are really becoming, or are the entry ticket to the market. Ingi spoke about this already. But basically aligning early with, for example, the CRCF in Europe or the international standards would really open a new avenue for Turkey or Turkish businesses to be able to export also removals into essentially the biggest carbon market next to its door. I'll pause here.
Well, so far, the webinar is like a policy encyclopedia, which is great for us, very rich content. So I want to thank you both again. So the EU framework is particularly relevant for Turkey and the neighboring markets because European rules often influence investment decisions, standards, and of course, national policy design beyond the EU itself. And also, as Inji also underlined, the Article 6 of Paris Agreement enables international carbon trading by, structuring bilateral agreements and international carbon crediting, therefore positioning some countries into carbon exporters or some others as carbon importers, which will probably be defined with the shape of their NDC or, let's say, emission goals. That brings us to one of the most debated questions in CDR policy today, whether and how renewables should be integrated into emission trading systems and, of course, other carbon market mechanisms. Attila, what developments are you seeing in the EU, India, and Japan regarding the possible integration of CDR into emission trading systems or similar market mechanisms? What opportunities could integration create, and what safeguards would be needed to protect emission reduction ambition and market integrity altogether? And Inji, could you add the perspective from the United Kingdom, Denmark, and any other relevant examples as you wish? How are the policymakers approaching the role of CDR within emissions trading, public procurement, contracts for difference, or separate market mechanisms? Which design choices appear most important at this stage? Attila, over to you.
Thank you. How much time do we have?
As much as you want.
No.
But just a second. We are a little bit behind our flow, like 7 or 8 minutes behind. So it will be great if you can just really try to be short down. We can talk a little about Turkey and the wider region a little bit more.
Sure. Okay. I'll give you a short version, and I again recommend for those who are interested to look up the analysis by Carbon Management Europe on the ETS. This is the hottest topic right now in Brussels. So when it comes to the European Union ETS, and we're getting closer to the Turkish context because Turkey is obviously piloting its own emission trading system. Generally speaking, the most durable demand that I believe one can see is when the carbon market itself pays for removals. That's the polluter pays principle also that we refer, which is something that we regularly refer to. The EU has just taken a landmark step last week toward its own EU ETS and has basically decided to be using the ETS to also, on the other hand, help scale permanent CDR. So what it basically does is just it proposed bringing or increasing the EU's ETS's cap, the emissions cap, from 2031 to 2040 by an extra amount of allowances of 250 million. Okay, and it's going to use those allowances or the revenues from these allowances to help buy permanent CDR credits from bio CCS and from DAX installations. There is also another contingency reserve of another 10 million allowances, which it basically can use to help cover, price differences. So the idea essentially is, on the one hand, to cover industrial residual emissions with to counterbalance them with removals, but on the other hand, to provide a robust, sustained, and long-term demand signal for removal suppliers, and this demand signal will escalate over time. There's another interesting avenue which is opening up. I'll just mention it, and then we'll come back to that in the Turkey, and then when we talk about Turkey, which is the international credits part. And this is very lucrative for Turkey, for example. The European Union, under its climate law, plans to meet part of its 2040 target with permanent removals, actually up to 5% of its 1990 baseline emissions. And so what that means is the ETS will be using additional allowances. This is separate from what I just said. So additional 260 million allowances to pay and buy removal or credits, actually international credits from outside the EU. So here you have a potential new market that is opening up to countries like Turkey, which is very attractive. I'll pause here, and I'm sure Inji wants to add.
Cool. Well, yeah, just to build off of that a little bit more. Yeah, firstly to say the good news is that there's so many different examples out there that it's we'll never be able to do justice to it in an hour's webinar, but just to point you to the policy chapter that was released as part of the State of CDR last month. So in version 3, and I'll just paste it in the chat there. The policy chapter in particular dove deep into a number of G20 examples, really trying to get to grips with the CDR landscape. So it can be a really good reference point for trying to orient different aspects of that framework. But really just to say also with, regarding whether it's ETS integration or whatnot, again, it's really important to kind of appreciate these different models of regulation, and especially this clear identification of where the primary onus of catalyzing this industry lies. So in the UK, similar to Denmark, it's the government that's taken that leading role to try and to build that that regulatory landscape. Now the UK has done a number of different things to do that. So Attila mentioned the contracts for difference, for instance, but the UK also funded this core program, which is the largest research program to date, and looked at both combining demonstration projects in a number of different field trials and pathways, also with the policy implications, and policy not just in terms of regulatory recommendations, including a report we released last year that looked at the comparison of the different standards out there, whether it was the ICBCM's core carbon principles or indeed the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and what they mean for specific types of CDR pathways. So governments can play a really key role in building that or addressing the knowledge gap for one, but critically also, again, in terms of the different roles in which bringing sectors into the picture. And last year also I took part in the government's Jet Zero task force, which really looked to the aviation industry to get some answers about how it was going to start taking an active role in funding CDR. Out of that, there was the promise of an advanced market signal, so airlines voluntarily buying CDR, even when currently it doesn't fit well into the CORSIA regime. So again, this is an example of there is pain points out there, both at the domestic level, but also internationally in terms of how this regulation applies to CDR pathways. But there's creative and innovative ways in which to still catalyze that demand and to put that signal out into the world early. And these really do matter, especially on that supply side, because to show that kind of bankable demand, as the contract for difference model even does, these are 15-year contracts, right? We need that long-term certainty. But the good news is that the certainty is very clear in terms of the science, that we know we need to scale up to billions of tons of CO2, and we know how to do that, and we just need to get on with that job. So ETS integration, but also these different ways that governments have started to tackle this issue and provide some good evidence for this. And I would really encourage diving into the chapter 5 there in the State of CDR report for the latest on how different countries around the world are doing that. Thanks.
Well, thank you both. I am unmuted. Yes, perfect. Thank you both. Like, this has been an amazing session. I'm so excited. Now we would like to bring the discussion directly to Turkey and the wider region. Many countries in these regions are either don't have any CDR in their agenda yet, or maybe just entering the CDR discussion recently, while the international rules are still developing, and like some countries are developing frameworks. So Inci, let's start with you. We are a little bit behind our timing, so maybe a little bit less than we planned originally. Let's start with you. In your opinion, if policymakers want to begin building a credible CDR framework, where should they start? Which foundational policy elements should be prioritized first? You gave some hints, but This question is a good question, I think, for our audience now. And my second question for Attila is, we would like to connect this policy foundation with finance and implementation. So what policy measures could help translate the CDR potential of Türkiye and the wider region into credible and financeable projects? Like how could governments do what they could do to mobilize the private capital, create early demand, etc. Yes. So, Inge, maybe you can start first.
Wonderful. Well, so diving right in, I think it's critical that countries really do that work to understand where does the comparative advantage lie, both in terms of, nature-based CDR methods, afforestation, reforestation, what do current deployment levels look like, what is the potential for scale, but also in terms of some of these innovative and more kind of novel CDR pathways too, because there's a number of different inputs that are required for the diversity of pathways. So really doing that homework early can really ensure that the country is best positioning itself in terms of its CDR policy. Then you have to look at, okay, so once we know the scale of either the supply, but also the potential demand, what kind of emissions can we foresee emitting into the future as a country, we can start to think about the kinds of regulation that we need to unlock that. And this is where I'd point back to this roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulation we released last year. We came up with 6 pillars. The first one being that you need to ensure that the framework is enabling efficient and effective financing. Carbon credits may not be the most effective and efficient form of financing for certain pathways. For others, they might be. Second, really ensuring that end state of net zero is really clear. So, how does this policy track to a world where we've balanced our residual emissions with removals? And then what does that mean beyond that into that net negative? The third is ecosystem integrity. So it's incredibly important in this world, as Attila said, without trust, you don't have a market. And in essence, that standard of integrity is really critical. But equally ensuring it works on the ground for local communities. And so step 4 is really unpacking equitable responsibilities and outcomes for the local community. However, you don't just need the substance, you really also need the enforcement and oversight measures to be able to ensure that that regulation is working well. And number 6 is also concerning, how easy and accessible is it as a framework to use? The advantage of the 45Q tax credit was that it was simple to understand and again to plug into different systems. ETS integration does get complicated, but that payoff can be worth it. But, we really need to think about how to make sure that whatever system we're establishing for CDR policy, that it is accessible and easy to use. So I'll pause there and pass to Attila. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Inge. And I'd like to add a word on the why. We talked a lot about the what and the how, but why is this CDR policy increasingly important for Turkey? So 2 things I'd like to throw out there. One is the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the EU, right? So basically, it's the EU putting a carbon levy on imported products. Now, let's not forget, the EU is buying half of the exports from Turkey. That's one. The second is, as I alluded earlier to, the Turkish ETS, which is piloting this year, is going to also put a price on carbon domestically. And I'd like to offer a reframe. So these things that put a price on carbon could essentially be an opportunity also by building removal capacity in Turkey domestically. And this is where it gets really exciting, to be honest. So we talked about this with Gökçe and Pınar, and Turkey has actually both the industrial basis, but also the geologic and geographic physical potential for various CDR pathways. It has a lot of olivine-rich rock that turns CO2 permanently into stone, for example, through mineralization and enhanced rock weathering. Actually, let me give you an anecdotal evidence here. This is from a colleague who I work with at an Austrian developer running enhanced rock weathering. He says that they're basically in Bulgaria, they're using crushed rock powder from Turkey because it's the best they can get. That has to do with its composition, and you can find that on the shorelines of Turkey, basically in mass. And so several countries could benefit from them, but primarily also Turkey. Now, also, let's not forget in the industrial base, there's a lot of cement and steel, and Turkey's own long-term emissions reduction plan covers carbon capture, so point source carbon capture, which is going to be play an important role as part of the carbon management. Now, there's also biomass. There's crop residues. I understand Turkey has, I think, 24 million hectares of land for agriculture, which is like unfathomable. And so it can use that land also for things like enhanced rock weathering, biochar, which then essentially will also increase crop yields. And then let's not forget strategically, Turkey is also working on new energy sources. There's, I think, a new nuclear plant in the pipeline. There's a vast potential for geothermal energy, which is a very important driver for potentially direct air capture in the long term. So I think all of these are really important drivers that can enable Turkey to benefit from carbon removal capacity as an asset to not only meet and reduce its exposure to ETS or to CBAM, but also to, beyond that, sell removal or export removal capacities and services actually into the region. Turkey, as most of you here online will know, exports already appliances, home appliances, and other things like that, machinery into neighboring countries. So I think that's very promising. So I just want to end on I think building on what Ingi just said. I want to end on 4 broad steps. And I'm happy that Nazik is with us. So basically, going forward, this is just a high-level roadmap. Okay, again, this is very highly context-specific. But building on what Ingi just said, I would also echo that the first step should be a proper assessment of the potential. Like we're guessing, we're relying on secondary sources. I would like to see something like carbon gaps, carbon removal readiness assessment done in Turkey, which basically maps out where the removal potentials are, which ones they are, what the trade-offs are, the co-benefits, and so on and so forth. So if anyone here has any cash to spare, please allow us to do such a readiness assessment with the help of Carbon Gap. Secondly, I think Turkey then should be in a wonderful position to be able to coordinate its policies for CDR across different government agencies. So it's not only sitting in one ministry, but it's actually something that covers environment, agriculture, and so on, industry. And then beyond that, coordinate that with neighboring countries. Thirdly, I would say support a few projects to take out the risks from initial like landmark projects. And then lastly, fourth, I would say integrate CDR, permanent CDR into the ETS. And Turkey has a actually opportunity to leapfrog here. It doesn't have to retrofit it like the EU does. It can design its ETS with that in mind from the get-go. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Like this has been really great, and we can see a clear message from this section is that the region has important technical, industrial potentials, geographical potentials, but converting that potential into projects will require coordinated work across policy, finance standards, and institutional capacity. We can clearly see that. So one of our upcoming CDR stage sessions next month, in the next months, will focus more directly on Turkey's CDR potential and its possible role as a regional hub, which really excites us. This idea is really so exciting. So today's discussion provides an important policy foundation for that next conversation. So we have one more poll. I wonder, we have 7 minutes left. I think we are quite good with our timing a little bit. Maybe Gökhan, what do you think? Shall we do I think we can do the poll.
Let's do it very quickly. I'm launching it.
Yes. So we cannot have a Q&A session, but through polls, it's good to see where we are all. Get some of your some feedback from you. So let's quickly vote the polls. I cannot see it on my screen yet. I know some people had some difficulties. Some people wrote to me.
We have two
It's about
responses.
updates in Teams, I guess. Okay.
Yes.
So, which area do you think will have the greatest impact on scaling CDR in Turkey and the wider region? So you can choose one of the clear national strategies and targets, public procurement, financial incentives, integration with ETS and carbon markets, international standards and mutual recognition, corporate demand, and voluntary action. And the second question is, which is the biggest CDR policy gap today? Limited awareness among policymakers, lack of clear definitions and quality standards, insufficient financial incentives and public funding, weak integration with climate and carbon market policies, and limited regional and international coordination. I think this is all of the above, but yes.
So after today's session, my favorite word will be ecosystem integrity, definitely. It was very impressive on our both guest speakers' points. So if you have any questions, please write in the chat still. We won't have time to reply within our 1 hour slot, but we are ready to stay a bit more for those who want to ask questions. We have covered the wide policy landscape. Attila and Inji, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing such a rich range of national, international, and regional perspectives. Today's discussion has shown that scaling CDR requires a connected policy ecosystem, including clear quality standards, early demand, effective finance, credible market integration, and coordination across borders. We will upload the recording to our YouTube channel and share it with everyone who registered. Please stay connected through the COP31 Turkey Brief and CDR Turkey channels for the upcoming CDR stage sessions. And thank you to everyone who joined us and contributed to the polls, chat, and questions. We hope to see you again soon. But before we close, we would like to ask our speakers for one final takeaway. If you could recommend one policy priority that governments should focus on before COP31, what would it be? Inji, would you like to start?
Absolutely. I think it is doing that work to ensure that climate policy is actually taking that first step of really understanding the distinction between emission reductions and removals. I mean, it sounds simple, but it's often missing. And I think only by doing that can you start to tease out the unique incentives and opportunities and obligations that could arise in future regarding CDR development. So I think consulting your NDC, consulting your inventory, and looking to that as a first foundation. Thanks.
First of all, I wanted to say a word to you, Pinar and Gökhan, thanking you for all the efforts that you've done, not only today, but actually before today, with your leadership for the COP31 Turkey brief, and for raising the awareness, for doing all these webinars. I really, really look up to you. Thank you guys for your efforts there. Now, final takeaway from me would probably be, and I hope I was clear in this, we know the solutions. What we now need is evidence, and we need policy leadership. And all eyes are on the COP31 host. And I think now is the time to take on that leadership when it comes to the next clean tech industry. The Turkey is asked to price carbon at its borders and at home, and it can translate that into an opportunity if it takes on that leadership now. So again, the tools are there, the window is opening now, and I look forward to COP31. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really such a privilege for us to have both of you and listen to your comments, like deep dives. And if there are any questions, as Gökhan said, we are here a little bit more. So it was a great session. Thank you everyone for joining.
So I see Ezgi Güler has raised her hand. Ezgi, could you please put your question to the Q&A box or chat box, please?
I think there is also one more question. I can see in the chat box. Maybe Gökhan, you can also see that.
Oh, yes.
From Nazik, have agreements or ratifications been signed that explain the removal of carbon dioxide?
I understand this as a question, as like, is what a carbon removal is defined in a formal agreement or something like that. So Attila or Inji, would you like to go ahead to explain, or would you like us to just cover it shortly?
I'm open. I mean, I think, yeah, the short answer is that there are a range of definitions. Again, many national jurisdictions have defined that. Often, thankfully, many base this off the IPCC definition of carbon removal. This is really key because we need to distinguish it from, say, just CCS technology, which is from a point source, compared to CDR, which is reducing or removing the emissions rather from the atmosphere. So there is a common framework, although there's some differences in how it's applied in practice. And what's interesting pertaining to the regulation piece is, as I mentioned, it's not just a case of crafting new regulation, but really assessing the current state of regulation in ocean-based CDR. Some of the existing international conventions, such as the London Dumping Protocol, actually pose quite a few barriers to CDR deployment. And so there is requests for, ratification and modification of these, and varying standpoints as to whether or not that could still happen. And so, yeah, just to say that the definitions are really key, but equally not only new policy, but also ensuring that the previous decisions and regulations don't impede development in some important ways.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the reply, Inji. And Ezgi has a question. I will be curious to know the potential of novel CDR methodologies in Turkey. Attila just mentioned the study about it. Will be great to check. I can jump in quickly here. Like, Turkey has an immense potential. It's really like we can see in international papers, research papers about the biochar potential of Turkey and such. But we really don't have much projects yet, like not very few pilots, and we don't. I think we have been working on policy briefs with Attila and with Chris Neidel. So I think we are going to towards COP. We will get in touch with many people who are interested in that, with the ministry and the presidency, and we are really working hard to bring all these studies, like the potentials of Türkiye, and not only Türkiye, but Türkiye's leadership to become a hub in the region. That's also very important and quite exciting in our view. So that could be my answer, but please just join if you have any answers for that.
I'll just make a shameless plug again. I mentioned the carbon removal readiness assessment earlier, something which Carbon Gap has carried out in several countries already. It's a proven methodology, I believe, and we would love to see something like that in Turkey. So maybe we can get some, like do some crowdfunding or whatever. But I think that should be really the proper next step and a foundation before like building any further policies on that. So a carbon removal readiness assessment, which you can look up online, would be fantastic for Turkey.
And just a couple of short additions from my end, also just to provide some solid ground. Turkey has an enormous geothermal energy potential, which would be a perfect way to power direct air capture machines. Turkey has an amazing underground storage potential with some mineral sites, or also depleted oil and gas zones. Black Sea, Karadeniz has a perfect potential for carbon storage. I read an article which says in a regular oceanic situation, you are able to, let's say, define 2 to 3 kilometers of depth to store CO2. But in Black Sea, in Karadeniz, this depth is around 200 meters because of the anoxic layer and situation of Black Sea. Also, Turkey is Turkey is a heaven of organic waste, which enables very different biochar methods to be utilized, and also for BECCS, like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, to the industry, for the iron and steel industry, for the cement industry, etc. So therefore, if we had a real research about all these, that would be perfect to speak a lot more clear, but we currently don't have. So we need research, and funding for research. So I think, Pınar, it looks like we are done right on time.
Well, yes, thank you very much. And we can just wrap up and say goodbyes. And Polan is asking, may you share that paper? I think to you about the Black Sea. We are going to send emails to you with including the recording of the session and with all the reports we shared or the resources, and that could include that as well. So thank you very much.
Pilar, can I just ask quickly, are we planning to also publish soon the brief that you mentioned, the carbon dioxide removal Turkey brief, and then we could like send that link to participants, right?
Yes, we can do that when we are
Okay.
ready. Exactly.
Okay, I'll just drop in the paper for the Black Sea stuff into the chat box. Sorry, I don't have the link at hand, but this is something which Gökhan and I looked into. So there you go, and it will be on the new CDR Turkey brief.
Thank you, Attila. Thank you everyone for joining us again today. Let's finish the meeting. It was great to see you all. Attila, Inci, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Teşekkürler.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Inci. Thank you, Attila. That was great. Thank you so